In the autumn of 1347, 12 ships drifted into the harbor of Messina, their sails still set, their decks eerily silent. When townspeople rowed out to investigate, they found most of the crew already dead, and the few still breathing were dying in ways no one in the city had ever seen. Fever, blackened skin, and swellings the size of eggs rising in the groin and armpits. Within days, the sickness those ships carried had already stepped onto land. Within 5 years, it would kill somewhere between a third and half of everyone living in Europe. Before that autumn, Europe was a continent that believed, more or less, in its own permanence. Cities like Paris, London, and Florence had grown fat on trade. Their populations swelling for 2 centuries straight, their cathedrals climbing higher with every generation, as though stone alone could prove a civilization would last forever. Markets overflowed with grain, wool, and spice carried in from every corner of the known world. Nobody standing in a crowded market square in the summer of 1347. Imagine that within 3 years, half the people around them would be gone. The disease had traveled a long road before it ever reached Messina. Modern researchers trace its likely origin to the plains of Central Asia, carried west along the same trade routes that had connected Europe to China for over a century. The very roads and caravans that made the era's prosperity possible, now doubling as the delivery system for its collapse. Genoese merchants trading at a Black Sea outpost besieged by Mongol forces were, according to one contemporary account, among the first Europeans exposed, fleeing the siege by sea and unknowingly carrying the sickness with them toward home. The disease itself, we now know, was carried by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, riding in the bloodstream of fleas that lived on black rats. The same rats that traveled constantly aboard merchant ships and grain wagons, crossing the trade routes linking Asia to Europe. Nobody in the 14th century understood this. To them, the plague seemed to travel on the wind itself, or in bad air rising from swamps and corpses, a poison with no visible source and no predictable pattern, striking a wealthy merchant's house one week and skipping the beggar's hovel next door entirely. The symptoms came fast, and they came in a form the human body seemed helpless against. First, sudden fever and exhaustion. Then, within a day or two, the buboes appeared. Swollen, blackened lymph nodes in the neck, armpits, and groin, so painful that victims reportedly could not bear to be touched. Black bruising spread beneath the skin as blood vessels burst internally, giving the disease the name history would remember it by. Most who developed the bubonic form died within a week. Those unlucky enough to contract its rarer, airborne form, spread by coughing rather than fleas, could die within a single day, sometimes without a single visible sign beforehand. Word of the disease traveled almost as fast as the disease itself, arriving in a city days or weeks before the first case did, so that by the time the sickness reached a town's gates, panic had often already settled in. Cities along the Mediterranean coast tried closing their harbors to incoming ships. An early, desperate form of quarantine, the word itself borrowed from the Italian for 40 days. The length ships were sometimes forced to wait offshore before landing. It rarely worked. The rats and the fleas riding on them did not care about harbor regulations. City governments, desperate to hold on to some semblance of order, issued a flood of new regulations almost overnight. Certain trades believed to worsen the air, tanners, butchers, dyers, were pushed outside city walls entirely. Officials appointed dedicated corpse collectors, men who walked the streets at dawn, calling for households to bring out their dead. A grim occupation that paid well precisely because almost no one else was willing to take the risk. In some cities, watchmen were assigned to seal the doors of infected households from the outside, trapping the living inside alongside the dying in the name of protecting everyone else. Walk through a European city in the spring of 1348, and the transformation would already be visible in the empty stalls of the market square. In shops shuttered mid-morning, in streets that had been crowded with hawkers and carts only weeks before now. Eerily quiet except for the occasional cart creaking past, loaded not with grain, but with bodies. Guilds that had structured urban life for generations, controlling everything from bread prices to who was permitted to practice a trade, found their entire membership gutted within months. Workshops that had employed a dozen craftsmen might suddenly have one master left alive. Forced to train apprentices faster than tradition allowed simply to keep basic goods, bread, shoes, nails, moving through a city that still needed them regardless of how many hands remained to make them. Inside the home still occupied, families made impossible choices daily. Some walled themselves inside, refusing to open doors even to relatives, convinced that isolation was the only defense against a disease no one understood. Others, believing the end of the world had arrived, abandoned all caution entirely, drinking, gambling, and indulging every appetite on the theory that if death was coming regardless, there was no longer any reason to hold back. Boccaccio, writing from Florence during the worst of the outbreak, described both responses playing out on the very same street. Physicians, trained in a medicine that had barely changed since antiquity, had almost nothing that actually worked, though they tried everything they had. Bloodletting, to balance the body's supposed humors. Forced vomiting, to expel the poison believed to be causing the fever. Sweet-smelling herbs and pomanders held constantly to the nose, worn in the belief that foul air itself was the enemy and could be fought off with the right scent. None of it slowed the disease by a single day, though the confidence with which it was prescribed likely gave dying patients a strange, false comfort in their final hours. Out beyond the city walls, the countryside suffered its own quiet catastrophe. Fields that had fed entire towns went unharvested because the hands needed to bring in the grain were dead or too afraid to work alongside their neighbors. Livestock wandered untended through empty pastures. Manor houses that had depended on dozens of peasant families to work their land found half their workforce gone within a single season. A shortage that would eventually hand surviving peasants leverage their ancestors never possessed. As the death toll climbed past anything a normal burial system could handle, cities were forced to abandon centuries of tradition around how the dead were treated. Individual graves, coffins, and funeral rites gave way to mass burial pits dug on the edges of towns, sometimes filled with dozens of bodies in a single day, laid in careful rows at first, then simply stacked as the numbers overwhelmed even that effort. In London alone, emergency cemeteries like East Smithfield were consecrated specifically to receive plague dead. Archaeological evidence showing gravediggers still trying, even amid catastrophe, to maintain some shred of order and dignity in how bodies were laid to rest. Trust itself became one of the plague's quieter casualties. Neighbors who had shared meals and celebrated weddings together now eyed each other with suspicion, wondering who might already be carrying the sickness beneath an outwardly healthy face. Doctors visiting the wealthy began charging fees that bordered on extortion, aware that fear alone could command almost any price. Even within families, contemporary accounts describe parents abandoning sick children and children fleeing dying parents. Ordinary bonds of loyalty strained past their breaking point by a disease that offered no warning and no mercy. Churches, meanwhile, faced a crisis of their own. Priests died at rates even higher than the general population, because their duty required them to sit with the dying and administer last rites, bringing them face to face with infection daily in a way most other Europeans could avoid. In some regions, up to half the clergy died within a single year, leaving parishes without anyone qualified to bury the dead, hear confession, or explain, in any way that made sense, why God would allow such devastation to fall on the faithful and faithless alike. Into that vacuum of explanation stepped fear, and fear demanded someone to blame. Bands of flagellants marched from town to town across parts of the continent, whipping themselves bloody in public squares, convinced that visible penance might turn back God's wrath, drawing huge crowds who watched, prayed, and sometimes joined in themselves.
Far darker accusations spread alongside them. Rumours that Jewish communities had deliberately poisoned wells to cause the plague. Rumours with no basis in fact that nonetheless triggered massacres across dozens of towns and cities. Entire communities burned or expelled by neighbours desperate for someone tangible to punish. By the time the first wave finally receded around 1351, the numbers were almost impossible to comprehend. Historians now estimate that somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's population died within those few catastrophic years, entire villages left completely empty, their fields growing wild because there was no one left alive to work them. Contemporary chroniclers, struggling to find words adequate to what they had witnessed, often simply wrote that the living were barely enough to bury the dead. And yet, out of that devastation, something unexpected began to take shape. With so many labourers dead, those who survived suddenly found themselves in a position no peasant in living memory had ever occupied, genuinely scarce, and therefore genuinely valuable. Wages rose sharply as landlords competed for a shrinking pool of workers. Peasants who had been bound to the same land for generations began demanding, and sometimes winning, freedoms their grandparents could never have imagined asking for. The rigid social order that had structured European life for centuries had cracked, and it would never fully reset to what it had been before. The plague did not vanish after 1351 either. It returned again and again over the following centuries, in 1361, in 1369, in wave after wave that never again matched the horror of that first outbreak, but kept the fear alive across generations who grew up hearing stories of what their grandparents had survived. Death itself became a fixture of art and imagination in the decades that followed, painted again and again on church walls as a skeletal figure leading kings, bishops and peasants alike in the same endless dance, a reminder that no rank, no wealth and no wall had truly protected anyone from what had come. Long after the last mass grave was filled, the plague's fingerprints remained visible in ways few of its survivors could have predicted. Universities, thinned of scholars and priests, slowly opened their doors to a wider range of students than before. Vernacular languages gained ground against Latin as the ranks of Latin-trained clergy shrank. Some historians even trace the labour shortages of these decades forward to the economic conditions that later fed the Renaissance, a golden age quietly seeded in part by catastrophe. Europe that emerged from the Black Death was smaller, poorer in the short term, and permanently changed. Fewer hands worked more valuable land. Old certainties about God, order and hierarchy had been shaken in ways that would echo for generations, quietly feeding into religious and social upheavals still a century or more away. The pandemic that broke medieval Europe did not simply kill, it rewired the continent's entire understanding of what a society owed its people, and what its people, having survived the unimaginable, felt entitled to demand in return.